the first person that actually said that to me was Ralph Lauren. So I was interviewing with Ralph. I'd gone through 5 layers of interviews to get there. He said, you know what? I really like you. And there's definitely a place for you in this company, but it's not this job. And then he said, but let's chat for a little while. How was Tom? So we had a little chat about that. And then he said, so what else do you want to ask me? And I said, I'd love to talk to you about branding because I don't think anyone's ever done it better than you. Can we talk about that? And he's like, yeah, sure. And he's like, well, let me ask you first, how do you think about branding? And of course, being, the nervous, whatever I was, 34-year-old at the time, I just rabbited on. And he said, it's really interesting. I said, well, how do you think about branding, Ralph? And he said, deposits and withdrawals.
Whoa.
I was like, that's a bit simpler. He said, why do we do the runway shows? Why do we have the mansion? It was a $200 million mansion that he had a store in, that he owned. And the car collection and the documentaries and the ranch, all the celebrities, all the movies, they're all deposits.
Guys, welcome to another episode of The Target Table. And today joining us, we have Josh Sparks.
Thank you for having me. So good to be here.
The first thing I said to my team is we got Josh Sparks coming in and everyone's like, what a name.
So I was asked so many times, when I first moved to London, it was actually the first question they asked me in the job interview I had. It's like, is that a stage name or is that actually your name? No, it's legit. It's my real name. There's a lot to live up to with that.
Yeah.
I feel like I've been chasing the promise ever since, but
you've lived up to it, man. You came in here with a bang and sparked up with some good conversation. So what's your heritage? Where did that come from? Just out of curiosity.
It's a really good question. I haven't actually done the DNA genealogy thing, but sort of family lore is it's some mashup of English, Irish with a little bit of French. So I'm not actually sure where the Sparks came from.
So curious, man.
Yeah, because I used to look super Irish, right? I was really pale with freckles, and then I got onto that peptide that makes you tanned.
Yeah.
And another funny twist on that was I was catching up with a friend in New York who I hadn't seen since I'd lived there, and I did not have the peptide when I was in New York. And he opened his door and he goes, Jesus, what happened to you? I was like, what are you talking about? I look great. He's like, man, you look a little freaky. And then we went out to dinner with some friends of his, and I hadn't met them before, and they asked me if my heritage was Latin or Mexican. So I took that as a compliment.
Yeah. I took melanotan at once when I was in the gym. Is that the same thing?
That's the peptide. That's
Dude.
it.
So I remember I was working at World Gym and a friend of mine was like, hey, you want to get real tan? I'm like, yeah, you used to have like red hair and freckles. What happened? He had like brown hair and he was tan all of a sudden. And I was like, what happened to you, man? He's like, oh, peptides. And when you're in the gym lifting weights, you want to look as good as a physique as you can get. So I was like, okay. People started asking me if I was Greek or Italian.
Yeah.
But everyone perceives you as more ripped. They're like, you're looking great.
You're so
lean
lean right
now.
now.
Literally took peptides for a week. But the crazy thing is, man, you could lay in the sun for an hour and get super tan.
Super dark.
Yeah. It was the weirdest thing.
And there is actually good evidence to suggest that it's highly protective of DNA.
Yeah.
Like melanin does protect DNA.
Yeah.
But for the kids out there, it's not 100% kosher in Australia anymore, unfortunately.
My friend almost got locked up for selling it.
Really?
Yeah, I'm not going to call his name out. He's probably listening, but
Can you give it to me later? Or?
Oh, maybe. He got in a lot of trouble. He probably, I'll tell you on the DL. But yeah, he was like looking it up online. He's like, oh, it's a gray area. There's no laws that says you can't sell it. But what happened was,
technically true.
Yeah, he got busted because he was ordering it and then labeling it.
Okay.
So the trip up was he was branding.
He was branding it.
Something that was classified as like a medical product.
Yeah, right.
So there's a lot of regulations you should go through. So it wasn't that it was illegal; it was that he was branding it.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
on a podcast about branding.
Yeah.
So so don't brand melanotan.
Careful what you brand. So I almost joined the business with him and everything, and I was like, "This is great! What a great product! I can't believe it's not illegal." And then he's like, I'm looking at 2 years. I was like, glad I didn't jump in. Yeah, he's all good now. He got out of it.
Oh, that's good.
Good bloke.
Because that's a ridiculous prosecution, but we'll save that for another day. But what a waste of resources. I mean,
what a great guy! Like, just figured out a way. He was selling so much of it,
really,
online and all the rest of it, and he got busted by what's our version of the feds?
The feds. I think they're the feds.
Is it still the feds in Australia?
Australian Federal Police.
Yeah, Australian Federal Police. He got busted. They raided his house and everything. Yeah,
that just seems like a massive waste of taxpayers' money to me. But whatever.
It's a tanning. It's a tanning agent.
It's a tanning
like
agent.
Kicked in his door, raided his house, found the product.
Like it's a meth lab or something.
Yeah,
just ridiculous.
Crazy, man. But it's a fun story. He loves talking about it. It's just dodge a bullet with the with the jail time.
He's got a great story. As long as he doesn't do time and it just remains a great story. Yeah.
Well, you look great, man. You're looking wonderful. Dude, your background is fascinating. You've worked in a lot of different tropes and traits and different situations and different types of industries, mainly around the orbit of fashion and tech.
Yeah.
But how did you even end up in the world of fashion? Because it's a weird, tight knit community from what I understand of it. Like it's everyone kind of in the industry knows each other.
Yeah.
How did you even find yourself in that in the first place?
That's a great question. So I studied law in Queensland and worked in London for a little while with a consultancy in London. And when I came back, I knew I wanted to take some of that business stuff, but work in a more interesting space. And I'd always had a bit of a thing for fashion. I actually started a Schoolies Week t-shirt company in high school, which we sold in my second year of university. The trademark was the only thing worth any money, but we trademarked it.
What was it?
The Schoolies Week. We trademarked Schoolies
You
Week.
trademarked the Schoolies Week?
Yeah, it had never been trademarked. So, and
what year was that?
Oh God, man, I'm dating myself here. So I started in 1990 and sold it in 1992.
Wow. Okay.
So I'd had a bit of exposure, if you call t-shirts for Schoolies kids exposure, but I knew it was a fun industry and it seemed like the barriers to entry were low, albeit the relationship barriers to entry, your point, were high. Actually getting some good people together and coming up with some good ideas and producing some product didn't seem that tough. But for me, I'd always loved music and I'd loved film, and I was a terrible actor and did a little bit at university. So that creative space really attracted me. And it was obvious to me that I didn't have sufficient creative talent to be the creative.
Gotcha.
So I was thinking, well, how can I support them? Because it seems like the Aussie industry, we have a couple of really standout hits every generation, but there's an awful lot of brands that don't make it, and there's an awful lot that just sort of limp along. And it seemed to me that there was an opportunity for someone with a legal background, a commercial background, and some good experience in business to add some value to some of these young brands. So I started interviewing, and it was through a friend I met Sarah Jane and Heidi. So Heidi actually went to my high school, but she was ahead of me. So we didn't know each other at school. But I think because I was a Brisbane guy and she was a Brisbane girl, and we had this mutual friend, they tolerated me for an interview. And it was hard work getting that job. I think they were deeply skeptical of me. I was this kind of nerdy legal guy who had just been doing management consultancy in London.
Pre-peptides?
Pre-peptides. There was absolutely nothing cool on my side of the table whatsoever. And they were very cool. They were just starting to pop. They had a whole bunch of PR. So I think that to answer your question directly, it came through serendipity. It came through this friend who I did law school with, who knew Heidi and knew that Heidi had Heidi and Sarah Jane had a GM that hadn't quite worked out, and they were looking for someone new. Yeah. So that was pure luck.
Wow.
And I'd had a bunch of interviews, and I don't think I was doing terribly well in them. The kind of interviews where you think I nailed it, and then you never hear back.
Yeah.
So clearly I was doing something wrong.
Yeah.
But I was determined to make the most of that. They started me as GM, and I was basically on a 6-month probation, which is common now, but back then that was rare. Like they wanted an extended period of time to test me out. And it went really well. We grew the business very quickly, and they were amazing. They're great designers, and they were fantastic at PR. And my job was to turn that into a sustainable, profitable business. So distribution deals and licensing deals and retail and e-com and all the rest of it, to build a structure around them to make the most of their talent.
Yeah.
And it ended up going really well. So I was there for 5 years. And
when did that start?
So I joined in 2001 and I left at the end of 2006.
Yeah.
And we sort of grew about 35x through that time. And when I left, it was the hottest fashion brand in Australia, and that was mainly them.
That was
obviously.
Sass and Bide, was it?
Sass and Bide, yeah. They then had a bit of a difficult period, and then came good again. But when I left, it was doing really well. So I think to answer your question, it is a tough industry to get into. You have to knock on a lot of doors, and you have to come with a bit of an angle. Like if you're not the designer and you're not coming in with some proven skills, then it's a bit of a hustle.
Yeah.
But having said that, it is an industry that is in desperate need of real talent, because it doesn't pay super well, particularly in the early days. Most brands struggle a little bit.
Yeah.
And even those brands that are doing really well, you don't get into fashion for the pay. If I wanted that, I would have stayed as a lawyer or got into banking or something incredibly dull but really well remunerated. So no one is in fashion for the dough. Most people are in it for the creative experience, the creative opportunity. But having said that, it's got to be profitable, otherwise no one keeps their jobs.
Yeah.
So there's a real need for savvy business people and savvy operational people, good logistics people, good production people. And Australia has a small talent pool. So I'd say anyone who wants to get in, this podcast is meant to be a recruitment pitch for the fashion industry, but I'd say if you're determined to get in, you can. You've just got to keep knocking on doors because the talent pool is small, and that also means it is a bit of a closed network, and you do have to break through. But then if you've proven yourself here, there's a lot of fantastic Aussies that I worked with in New York and in Philadelphia and LA, and there's Aussies who have come from the Australian fashion industry working all over the world. So it can be a nice launching pad.
Yeah. So take me back to 2001. You joined Sass & Bide.
Yeah.
You somehow get through the interview process.
Skin my teeth.
You've got a bit of business acumen, I imagine. You're a great communicator, obviously studying law. And did you have anything before that other than the Schoolies thing, or like
nothing in fashion?
No.
And the business I worked with in London it started as a recruitment consultancy and then moved into acquiring software, like HR software. So it was sort of pivoting into it's before the days of SaaS, obviously, but it was pivoting into more of a hybrid between sort of outsourced HR, technology to support HR, and then sort of search and selection and recruitment. And what I ended up sort of wangling my way into there is that the business of Robert Walters, and Rob was an amazing guy. I'm sure he still is. I haven't seen him in a long time, but I kept pitching him on technology, and it was sort of the rise of Monster. And you guys, I don't think you would even remember
what is Monster?
Monster.com. Monster.com was going to kill the global recruitment industry. It's just basically a massive matchmaking service for resumes and jobs, but compared to Seek, very unsophisticated. But it was the first .com boom, and they were valued at a gazillion $billion. And all the traditional recruiters were very concerned. And there was this fear that you were either kind of high touch, you were high tech, and never the twain shall meet. And it's weird talking to people today about this, because now that hybrid of kind of physical, omni-channel, whatever you want to call it, that's just normal now.
Yeah.
But back then it was like, okay, you're either a pure play tech business because you want to secure the valuation and all the notoriety that goes with that, or you're some kind of cumbersome old world physical high touch business. And so that just seemed really weird to me. So my pitch to Rob was, why don't we have sort of a good, better, best like you do in retail? Let's have a good, better, best strategy. And if someone wants to come in and a company wants to come in and post a job on a board and they want to pay $20, well, clearly they're not going to be able to afford the full service, whether that's recruitment or search and selection. But it could be a really nice way to, onboard potential new clients and get them to know us and So eventually he agreed, to my amazement. I had to resign. I resigned and moved to California for about 4 weeks and interviewed with 3 or 4 startups out there, and I was determined to make it in San Francisco. And 4 weeks in, I'd burnt like 80% of my savings. I was like, this is going to be harder than I thought. I'm not a millionaire yet. You know, I'm 4 weeks in. And Rob called and said, hey, come back, we'll give you a big bump on salary and we'll give you a little equity and you can run this new tech arm for us. So I had a little bit of exposure to a more entrepreneurial way to grow a business. And I'd started to get some exposure because we did end up building a really nice tech platform for them. Where if we wanted to lean into technology, there was some really cool stuff starting to happen. And it was very nascent at that point, but it was obvious to me that the future was going to be some kind of hybrid. There was going to be a wonderful opportunity to exploit the best of the digital realm.
Yep.
But when you pair that with the best of whatever you can do in the physical realm, whether that's physical retail or physical services, then that seemed to me to be the future. And, I haven't made many other good predictions in my life, but that one turned out to be a good one. So I guess that was part of my pitch to the girls as well. Yeah. That I had some good exposure to technology.
3 very different worlds, right? Like technology is up and coming. It's very new, maybe similar to what we have right now with AI. It's this very new thing on the horizon everyone's looking at. The recruitment space, the legal space, you traveled abroad, you come back, you get this role. Yeah. Early 2000s, like what was the fashion industry like then in Australia? Like what was your experience?
So, I mean, it was so different. the way it is today. There were still some trade barriers up. I think they'd started to come down. I can't remember exactly where we're at with trade barriers, but there wasn't a lot of international competition.
Yeah.
So the big designer brands were here, and those sort of iconic heritage brands in mass market like a Carhartt or a Levi's, obviously they were everywhere. But in terms of what we would call contemporary fashion brands, so one level below designer, so we had luxury brands, we had some designer brands, but the contemporary level American brands just weren't here.
Yeah. So when you say contemporary, what do you mean by a contemporary brand? What's an example of that?
So, an example in Australia back then would have been Sass & Bide.
Yeah.
Today it'd be something like Basic in a casual range, or it'd be something like Camilla and Mark in women's, or it would be something like MJ Bale in men's. Or so it's got, excuse me, it's got a level of quality and a level of it's an ethically made product to a degree. There's a level
would
of
you put like Lululemon in that kind of bracket?
Yeah, Lulu would be a great example of sort of lower end contemporary, higher end mass. You know?
Okay. How many categories do you look at in your head when you're looking at fashion? Like a lot of people ask us this question, like when they're trying to figure out their positioning, like how do you break that down?
So I think of it as, well, that's a really great question actually, because it almost depends by market a little bit, by category.
Yep.
But if we were talking in broad brushstrokes, you know, your luxury brands that everyone would be familiar with, so your House of LVMH, your House of Gucci, Brunello Cucinelli, Zegna, you know, Ralph, or the higher end Ralph would be. In fact, Ralph's a good example of one that dabbles in luxury, but it's more designer. But anyway, so you've got the high-end luxury brands that are typically heritage brands. They've been around for a while, but not always.
Established tradition.
Yeah. And sometimes for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
But not always. Like Brunello Cucinelli is a great example of a leading luxury brand that's relatively new.
Where would you put Mania Devoir? Are you familiar with that brand? No. They're kind of like a new up and coming. To me, it feels like that luxury. But
luxury?
I would say you're right. Like it's very hard for a brand to crack the luxury category.
Super hard.
Yeah.
And so country of origin is really important. Like you cannot make in China if you want to be luxury.
Yeah.
The way it's made, there's an artisanal approach typically to the making. It's handmade as much as possible. There's some real the brand promise, and I'm sure we'll get into this later, but the brand promise and positioning and all of the pillars and the value structure through which they express that is really, really important.
Yeah, so I'm excited to unpack that.
Yeah.
So you've got
luxury, designer, and designer would be like a Prada.
Yeah.
Would be a Ralph, the Ralph runway and catwalk shows, not your Ralph Polo, but the Ralph Lauren higher end product. I'm trying to think of brands that would be more familiar to.
Is it more like runway-esque?
Yeah,
like
it is
shoot centric kind of brands.
And luxury will show on runways as well, and catwalks. But it would be runways for men, catwalks for women. I don't know why they differentiate, but they do. Paris would be the home of your kind of luxury and a fair chunk of designer.
Yeah.
New York Fashion Week is mainly designer. And then if you're looking at contemporary, the contemporary brands are the brands that you see on the high street. So if you imagine like a big distinction between a luxury and say contemporary with designer somewhere in the middle is luxury has to be hard to find. It's exclusive. It's difficult to get. There's almost a level of intimidation in walking into one of those stores, and they won't have stores everywhere. So they deliberately satisfy market need. So supply demand, they are very deliberate in not fully satisfying demand. Now LVMH has challenged that over the last few years because they've been grow.
Yeah.
And Gucci as well. But then say Cucinelli represents the more traditional luxury approach where it's made in limited numbers. They're not expanding their factories because of demand. They're only going to expand supply in a very progressive way and only off the back of hiring more artisans. So if they can't find the right people to make it and therefore they can't maintain the quality and the promise to the customer around quality and all the ethics that go into making it, then they just won't grow.
Yeah.
Whereas an LVMH is quite blatant in, they'll do whatever it takes to grow. And they're constantly acquiring new brands to blow them up. Another one, blow it up. Another one, blow it up. So they are challenging the traditional luxury model. The traditional luxury model today is best represented by Hermes. As a very well-established, iconic heritage brand. And in terms of newer brands, I would say Brunello Cucinelli. And then I'd say Tom Brown, my old employer, would be definitely he'd be a player in that space as well.
Yeah. So then the contemporary layer, like that's more, you would see it in a lot more malls, a lot more shopping centers.
Much more broadly distributed.
Yeah.
Country of origin's less important. Price is more important. So even though it's expensive,
Yeah.
like you could, Zimmerman, I think Zimmerman would probably describe themselves as designer. I think traditionally they would have been considered a contemporary brand.
Yeah.
They're certainly pushing into some of their product is pushing into designer, but typically you're looking at it as at a dress, if we're talking about women's, it's sort of, $400 to $1,200. That would be smack bang. Yeah. And with the middle of the bell curve being that sort of $600 to $800,
Yeah.
that would be a contemporary product. Whereas if you start thinking about designers, you start thinking about your Stella McCartney. Stella McCartney is a great designer brand, for an example.
Yeah.
And her dresses would start at sort of $2,000, $3,000. But then when you're talking about Cucinelli, you'll pay $4,500, $5,000 for a sweater from Cucinelli.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a whole level up.
Yeah.
But it's not just about price. It's about the customer has to trust that there is a genuine commitment to buying the very best yarns and working with the very best artisans. And the idea is that it will last you 20, 30 years. Now, I know that LVMH has certainly challenged that notion because they want girls to own 15 handbags. It's not about, these days, it's not about buying something, keeping it for 20
like
years.
iPhone, like there's a new one every year. If you got last year's a handbag,
exactly,
you're old news. Yeah.
Yeah. But you look at it in Hermes and the Birkin is still incredibly in demand. I think it was designed in the mid 50s.
Wow.
So but if you think about sort of your designer, luxury, designer, contemporary, and then you start to move into mass, and and the Americans describe better mass and sort of mid mass and lower mass. Here in Australia, we've probably just got mass, and
that'd be like a Zara.
Zara I'd put in fast fashion.
Okay, so that's another tier down.
That's the lowest tier.
So describe mass, like just so I can.
So that would be what the sort of brands you might find in a Glue or in a So they're they've got an element that they're zeitgeisty, they're contemporary, they're on trend, they're all that good stuff, but they're produced to a price point. Yeah. And the idea is to move a lot of volume.
Like a Nike or like a...
Nike's an interesting one.
Yeah?
Yeah, because Nike, you would say, is definitely mass in terms of its distribution and volume.
Yeah.
But it's got a level of cool factor that you don't normally find in mass.
True.
Yeah. So it's a bit of an outlier. And there's all these exceptions that prove the rule.
Yeah.
And if you're talking about the number one in any category, they sort of write their own rules.
Yeah.
Like Apple, Nike, there's these examples where they're really hard to pigeonhole because they incorporate levels of consumer demand and consumer desire that you would associate with a designer or luxury brand, but they're a mass market product. And the iPhone's a mass market product.
Correct.
So it's an interesting space, and I think what we talk about in branding, as I'm sure you do all the time as well, is this. It's a bit of art, bit of science.
Yeah, true. I would agree with that. Yeah.
So you've got some rules, you've got some structures, you've got these little pyramids that you got. Then you got a matrix of markets and different competitors, and so you can map it all out in a deck and make it look like it's highly scientific. But then there is a level of sort of artistic magic to it as well.
Yeah.
And you can solve for that in a systematic way, by the way, but it's not something you can reduce to a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
So you can create an environment and you can build a talent pool and you can give them a very clear sense of purpose, and this is the promise that we're looking to honor. So you can solve for some of the variables, but at the end of the day, it's the synergy and the serendipity of that creative team are just going to produce something that you just wouldn't have imagined. And it happens to sit on a grid here and it happens to be price pointed here, but you weren't designing to that necessarily.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So whereas the lower you go down the spectrum, the stricter the adherence with those price points and those volume objectives are.
Gotcha. So if someone's finding themselves creating their own label and it seemingly is price centric, they're essentially in the fast fashion category.
Fast, mass, or lower end contemporary.
Yeah.
If it's price driven, and the last thing I would recommend to anyone is to be competing on physical attributes and price. At that point, it's going to be a victory of marketing. It's less about brand.
Right. So let's unpack that. Like if someone's looking to, let's just say, get into the space and create something, and you've worked with a lot of startup fashion brands over the years, do you find that there's a common trope or a common set of mistakes that people stumble through in the early era of creating their incubation
100%.
phase of their fashion brands? What might some of those be?
So I think start with brand. I think I talk to so many young designers or young creatives, so not necessarily limited to the fashion space, also in technology. They're coming at it from they're very tactical. So they've got an influencer strategy, and they've got a social strategy, and they've got a digital marketing strategy, and they've really dialed in TikTok. And I'm like, great, but what are we doing here?
Right. What is
your
brand?
purpose?
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing, and why should I care?
Yeah.
What is the fundamental purpose that you are trying to achieve here? And then from purpose, okay, how does that manifest as a promise to the customer? And then we sort of work our way down. And I think that is a really common mistake, because there's this sense of urgency, which I completely understand because I've been there. We've got to turn the cash register on. Like, we've got to get this thing humming. So let's get to brand later. Like, we'll figure that out later. The brand is the product. Yeah, we'll be fine.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening, of course, is if you're not defining brand in all its various aspects, the customer is going to define brand for you. And typically the customer is not thinking about, we think about our brands for about 60 hours a week. Our customer thinks about our brands for about 4 minutes a week.
Yeah.
So they're going to very simply deduce what your brand stands for based on whatever product you're selling, whatever price point it is. So, you're a suit brand. You're a t-shirt brand. You're cheap undies.
Yeah.
So instead of, no, you've got a whole different frame of reference for this category, and you're promising me something really cool because.
Yeah, so it's like almost like imagine you've never lived in our world and you walk into a store and you see a pair of Nikes, like a pair of Air Jordans for the first time.
Yeah.
In that person's head, they're like, it's a white shoe with a little tick on the side. It's $120.
Yeah.
And then that they make an assumption based on that information.
Yes.
Because they don't have, the history of Michael Jordan or
No.
the advertisements or the commercials or the experience of their friends wearing it in high school. There's no brand.
No.
It's an assumption.
So whereas when you and I go in and see a pair of Nikes, we're instantly in a narrative. And that
you're in the middle of like a scene.
You're in a scene.
Yeah.
And it's going to be different for you than it is to me. But we've grown up consuming Nike commercials, Nike propaganda, for want of a better word, Nike commercials. We love Nike sponsored athletes. We've seen Nike move into all sorts of different sports and different categories and
So if
dominate.
I'm a fan of basketball or
golf,
Serena
or running,
Williams or what have
right.
you. Yeah. Yeah.
So in our mind, Nike stands for something. And if they've done their job well, which they've done it incredibly well, Nike stands for victory. So even if it's subconscious, and most of the time for most consumers it is subconscious, not conscious, the association that they're making with that product is attached to whatever. Now, it may not be victory for them. It may be cool marketing, or it might be Michael Jordan, or it might be whatever. But the point is that it means something more than the sum total of the physical attributes of the product and its price point.
Yeah.
And if you're stuck pushing a product tactically and you're focusing on physical attributes and product, then you don't have a brand, and it's going to be a shit fight. Like, that is just a tough. There's a lot of blood in that water, and you saddle up. It's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. I know I've mixed my metaphors there. You're not going to be riding a horse in the water, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I get you, man.
So I think number one, start with brands and really spend the time to. It's kind of a bit of inner work, actually. It's kind of where modern psychology and Zen Buddhism and a little bit of manifestation crosses over. You've got to go inside and go, why am I doing this? Because if I can't clearly articulate, it's my idea. And if I'm having trouble articulating it to make it important, so why am I doing this and why should anyone care? What shared sense of purpose, what shared vision for a better future am I creating here with my community, with my customers? If I can't articulate that, then God knows how anyone else can. So before the temptation overcomes you to drift into, I know this cool influencer and I've got this great, and there's going to be this PR event or this club's opening or this celebrity's going to wear it. And that's all great, really important stuff.
Yeah.
And it's tactical. You need both. Like it's not like strategy is better
It's art
than
and
tactics.
science.
It's art and science.
So would you say
the
the brand is a bit more of the art?
Yes.
If you got the tactics down, you've got the capital, you've got the product, you've got the manufacturer, the supplier, the influencers, what have you. That's all science in your head?
I think the brand over-indexes art and the marketing over-indexes science.
They overlap.
It's a Venn diagram.
I would agree.
So I think, and there are definitely scientific, structural and systematic elements to branding, and there's definitely artistic and creative elements to marketing, obviously. But I think that if one indexes one direction, one indexes the other, I think the creative process that is required to create truly memorable brands, those that you are going to become attached to in a way that is genuinely emotive, genuinely emotional, and that brand starts to take on a role in your life, in your own narrative, such that you self-express through your purchase and your display of that brand. That's nirvana. Like that's where we want to be.
Yeah.
That's very powerful. And for me, it's also, it's a wonderful thing. Like you're bringing people real joy. You're creating a sense of shared meaning with your customer. So it happens to yield some amazing financial results too, but that's not what, I know it is what drives it for a lot of people, but for me, that's not what drives it. For me, the financial outcome is a byproduct of getting the brand right, creating a product of real integrity and wrapping it in a narrative that is so immersive and so engaging that of course people are going to buy it.
Because it's almost like you're saying, like people are trying to go straight to the cash register.
Yeah.
I've got the product, let's roll it out in the market, get that cash rolling in.
Yes.
But you're saying if you're not making deposits on the brand component, the narrative, the emotional connectivity, the story, the purpose, the meaning, like even like who do I become if I wear this? You know, I always joke that when I meet someone with a Rolex, I'm like, you know, what made you buy a Rolex? And they give you some fascinating story.
Yes.
And you're like, it's really status at the end of the day, right? So, but it's so deep rooted that people don't even know why they're buying it.
No, that's exactly right.
You know, like it's a very subconscious level thing. So when you're working with someone, let's just say they've got the tactics ready.
Yeah.
How do you, in a workshop, because I know you conduct workshops as a strategist as well, like how do you try to elicit why? Because I've had this happen in workshops where you're like, hey, like, what's your reason? And they're just stuck.
Yeah.
And they're scrapping for a reason. Do you have some go-to tactics that you use to kind of pull that out of people? Like what could someone do to try to figure out what that might be? And what should it be for fashion?
So, okay, so a couple of questions there. And I want to zip back for a second and unpack something you just said, because you mentioned deposits. And I think that's a really clever way to think of it. And the first person that actually said that to me was Ralph Lauren. So I was interviewing with Ralph and with Urban Outfitters and J. Crew. So I'd finished up with Tom Brown and I wanted to go to a large organization that had a significant investment in technology because I felt
and Ralph Lauren were doing that at that time?
Yeah. So David Lauren, his son, was sort of leading this push and some of it panned out and some of it didn't. Like they were playing around with some really interesting stuff like holograms and stuff. So look, they went in a couple of, you know, left field directions, but I mean, they were trying, and they were making some significant investments. So I was interviewing with Ralph, and he said in this, and this was a big experience for me.
So you're actually with Ralph Lauren?
With Ralph, yeah.
So you're not just the company, you were with him?
No.
Dude,
so
what was that like meeting him?
It was crazy. I'd gone through 5 layers of interviews to get there.
Yeah.
And he was just, and I'd sweated what to wear for a week. And I'd gone out and blown just a stupid amount of money on like head to toe Ralph Lauren. Like I'm talking boots, jeans, like shirt, cashmere sweater, leather jacket. Like it was just ridiculous.
And you were trying to figure out which version of
exactly.
him. Do I go in as the cowboy?
Am I leather? Am I double RL cowboy guy? Or what am I? So I walked, I got into his office, which was just stunning. It was like it was size of, you know, my apartment at the time.
Where was this?
So it was in sort of East New York, just sort of not quite Upper East Side, but sort of at the lower end of the Upper East Side.
And I imagine it's some ornate,
Madison Avenue, basically.
Like awesome looking building.
Beautiful, incredible art. It looked like a Ralph Lauren store, but not quite as fussy.
Yeah,
like just pared back a little bit. But he had unbelievable art on the walls. I can't remember. I've told the story a bunch of times, and I've almost sort of, I think in my own memory, mixed up what he had behind him. It was either a Warhol or Liechtenstein. I can't remember, but it was
either way.
It was amazing. Yeah. And so we sat down on these giant leather couches, and he was so gentle and so soft. Oh, the dress, I forgot to mention that. So I walk in going, okay, I've nailed it. You know, killed it. He gets up, he's wearing tracksuit pants, New Balance sneakers, and a sweater. I'm like, oh man, what a waste of $8,000.
What were you wearing?
I was wearing like black Chelsea boots, Ralph Lauren Chelsea boots, black jeans, black like turtleneck, went completely over the top, and Ralph Lauren leather jacket, which my wife at the time was very unhappy with me. But anyway, so he said to me, and I'll cut to the punchline, as it became clear that I was not going to get the job, but he said it in the most gentle way that anyone has told me that I'm not going to get the job. He said, you know what? I really like you. And there's definitely a place for you in this company, but it's not this job. I was like, oh, okay, that's the nicest rejection I've ever had. And then he said, but let's chat for a little while. How was Tom? You know, because Tom Brown had worked for Ralph before he set up his own. how was Tom? Like, I was really impressed with what you did there, and like, how did that go, and how's he doing now, and blah, blah, blah. So we had a little chat about that. And then he said, so what else do you want to ask me? And I said, I'd love to talk to you about branding, because I don't think anyone's ever done it better than you.
Yeah.
At least not in fashion. Can we talk about that? And he's like, yeah, sure. And he's like, well, let me ask you first, how do you think about branding? And of course, being, the nervous, whatever I was, 34-year-old at the time, I just rabbited on. And he said, that's really interesting. I said, well, how do you think about branding, Ralph? And he said, deposits and withdrawals.
Whoa.
I was like, oh, that's a bit simpler.
Just broke it right down.
Like, he said, why do we do the runway shows? Why do we have the mansion? Because they still had the mansion on Madison Avenue at that point, which was just the most, it was a $200 million mansion that he had a store in, that he owned. And the car collection and the documentaries and the ranch and the, blah, 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 all the celebrities, all the movies, they're all deposits. And, our business is very large, and we sell a lot of really beautiful product, and we also sell a lot of polo shirts. And so, it's important to have more deposits than withdrawals. And that was it. I was like, oh God, you just nailed it. Like, that's the shortest branding book ever written. But
he's right, because it's that simple.
It is that simple. There's a lot of nuance underneath that. And you have to be clear on purpose. He's very clear on purpose. So you've got to be clear on that at the top. But when you boil down what you're trying to achieve, you have to invest in the brand and everything it should mean to your customer, the whole narrative piece.
Yeah.
You have to invest in that more than you're asking back. And not in monetary terms necessarily, obviously, then you go broke. You have to reap more revenue than but he wasn't talking about spend.
Well, how do you think he saw it?
He was talking about mind share. So in a customer's, this is what I think anyway.
Yeah.
In a customer's mind, when they think about Ralph, they're not thinking about the off-price center in New Jersey that sells polo shirts for $35.
No, they're thinking of him as a cowboy at the ranch, the documentary, the mansions, the celebrities.
Totally.
Yeah.
The runway shows, I went to it was their 50th anniversary runway show, and there was a big dinner there afterwards, and it was unbelievable. Like, it was just completely over the top. It cost millions of dollars to put on. So I think that's what he means, because then that was all over Vanity Fair, and it was all over New York Times style section, and back when people still read print. I don't know what the equivalent is now, but he just got so much mindshare and was positioning the brand as representative of one vision of aspiration. Now, we all have different visions of aspiration, and different brands present us their vision of aspiration. We attach to whatever version of aspiration we find most attractive personally. But what Ralph did brilliantly, I think, was sort of take the best of like aristocracy and mashed it up with that sort of New England, northeastern gentry type vibe. It's just, I mean, for a long time, that worked really well. I actually think it's come off a bit over the last 10 years, because I think, your generation and younger are less attracted to such a blatant display of aspiration, but not everyone. Otherwise,
I would agree with you. Like, even thinking about my mother or my stepfather, that they would look at the magazines and be like, wow, like one day we want to like have a house like that.
Yes.
Because I remember Ralph had this range of furniture he had. And,
yes.
Yeah, it was very ornate, very luxurious. And with the generational thing, do you think that's forced these brands to change? Like, what's your perception on that?
I think most definitely.
Yeah.
So even if I think about brands that I've worked with recently, what the Ralph example I think is what he was really selling was entry into the moneyed class.
Yeah.
That there was
you can't just break into that industry without being lavish and extraordinary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was presenting you a vision of what life could be like if only you partnered with Ralph Lauren. It was effortlessly elegant. Everything was beautiful. It was vintage cars and gorgeous girls and handsome men. And it was just this non-stop party, but a very, very cool party, very understated kind of party.
Do you think he picked that up from someone? Like, where do you think that he...
Well, he
pulled that from?
His background's really interesting. I mean, he's he grew up in, was it Queens or Brooklyn? I think it was Brooklyn. And he started off as a tie salesman. I mean, he started selling ties. So he didn't...
I heard of that. It was like in Macy's or something.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Bloomies. Yeah, Bloomies.
He
and
was
Macy's, yeah.
a kid, and he didn't like what the ties looked like in New York at that time. He's like, they were kind of boring. He wanted to do something a bit different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he didn't come from money. And I think I don't know how poor he was, but he certainly didn't grow up in lavish circumstances, put it that way. And I think he had a lot of ambition and a lot of aspiration, and he knew he had a talent for, sartorial style, and he found a way in. And he has been building on that consistent thematic ever since.
Yeah, he's never gone wayward from that.
No.
Yeah, he's found it, stayed with it.
100%.
Yeah.
And if, there was an article on Tom Brown the other day that was really interesting. It was in Vogue Online, and it was an interview the day after his most recent show, and it was February 14th was his show, Valentine's Day, and it was February 15th. And they were talking about the fact that he was there for a photo shoot, and they were using this sort of mid-century modern chair as a prop, and he had his hand on the chair. And the photographer said, "Could you please take your hand off the chair and not use a prop?" And he said, "No." And I went, "Oh, okay." So, and to me, Tom, I spent a couple of years, almost 7 days a week with Tom. That's Tom. His vision was his vision. And when I first started working with him, all of us were top to toe in Tom Brown every day. And in fact, in my contract, I wore Tom Brown 7 days a week. And when I got the contract,
even on your weekends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, he runs in Central Park in cashmere running shorts and a Tom Brown singlet.
Bro, that guy's committed to his brand.
He is his brand.
Yeah.
There's no separation.
Wow.
And so that kind of, Bruno Cucinelli, if anyone's interested, check out their website and read the origin story there. He's the same. He had a vision, and he has obsessively stuck to that vision through good seasons, bad seasons, critical acclaim, critical criticism. It hasn't wavered. And so when I met Tom, the business was very troubled. The brand was extremely admired, and he definitely established himself in the lexicon of modern American designers.
So did he start off with Ralph and then broke out on his own and created his own vision?
Yes.
What year was this when you met him?
So I met him in 2008.
Okay.
Yeah. And it must have been 2007, because it was just before the recession started kicking in really badly. But his business was troubled already. He had some bad advice, as so many designers do, as so many musicians do, as so many creative people do. And he'd got himself into a little bit of trouble. But my point is, even in the darkest period where he desperately needed investment for this business to survive, and we were meeting investors, if he met an investor, this happened twice, where the investor would lean over and say, "Look, I think we just got to kind of dumb it down a bit. We just need to simplify it a bit. We just need to kind of pare back on the, really high pants and the tight little jackets, and we just got to make it a bit more." And he's like, "I'm done." And he was this close to bankruptcy, but his vision was so clear in his mind, and he was so committed to it, that he was not prepared to take investment that would compromise his creative vision. And I think you consistently hear this, whether it's musicians or whether it's designers or filmmakers, creatives that have reached the point where they have unpacked their purpose to the point where they have a really clearly articulated vision for what they're trying to achieve, and they are incredibly attached to it, then those that can make it through that difficult period where you're trying to convert the masses to your idea, if you can survive that and stay true to it, they're brands that typically, if they make it, they really make it, because we gravitate to that clarity of purpose. I think there's a strength in that. That conviction is really attractive. So when someone has a crystal clear vision, and this could be any category, a crystal clear vision of why am I doing this? Like, what is our purpose? What are the values that underpin it? The whole exercise around that. Why should you care? Like, why should it be as important to you as it is important to me?
Yeah.
And together we're sharing a vision for a better world, and we're going to manifest it through a partnership where I'm going to give you the accessories, whatever it looks like, whatever the category is. And through this partnership, you are going to self-actualize, and you are going to express yourself the way you really, truly want to express yourself, because we share this same purpose. That's really powerful.
So in the case with, Ralph or what have you, when you look at that contractual relationship between the brand and the consumer who's wearing it, right? Because we were talking about this before, like to wear fashion is to send a signal to the world. This is the kind of person I am. Yes. I'm in this tribe. And we're joking about tribe. A bit of tribalism when it comes to fashion. So we were talking about, for example, Kanye with Yeezys, or, even Elon Musk with Tesla or
Yes.
Cybertruck or what have you, like you were saying that if you're trying to build a brand that people love and admire, you almost have to be hated.
You have to be loved or hated.
Yeah.
Because I think, first of all, if you're genuinely doing something innovative, if you're genuinely doing something that is differentiated, but by definition, if what you believe you're doing is highly differentiated and defensible, then there's some level of innovation there because no one's done it before.
So would you say it's an opinionated approach, like you were saying, that uncompromising, unwavering element that you've seen people in this industry and other industries have, where they're like, it's got to be this way or I will go bankrupt?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
It is a little crazy.
What do you think it is? Is it a trait? Is it a type of personality? Like what have you witnessed that to be?
So there's, and I should stress that what I'm speaking to there is those brands that we would consider the best at what they do. So you're like, and there's obviously a number of brands in any category, but I'm talking about those that sit atop the pyramid. So in any category, you've got a pyramid of
Like
brands.
James Jabaya from Supreme.
Yeah.
I think someone offered him like $50 million for the ability to put Supreme shirts in their stores. And he was just like, nah.
No.
And this is like early days where he wasn't even making that much money.
Yes.
Like he was uncompromising.
Yes.
He's like, this is my vision. That's it. And I would say Supreme, to me, it seems like they really pioneered the suburban apparel space, and then no one's really come close to them except for maybe Off-White.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great example. So I'm not talking about the massive brands that you see in every mall that they're impulse commodity purchases.
Different ball
There's
game.
no loyalty there.
Different brand strategy, essentially. Yeah.
It's actually they're more retailers than brands. They're very good at what they do. So what they're doing is they're taking inspiration from, some would say copying, but they're taking inspiration from what's happening further up the pyramid, and they are producing it at a lower cost and getting it to more distribution points to a customer that either doesn't care or is just cruising along and makes an impulse purchase. That's not what I'm talking about. So the value that accrues to those at the top of the pyramid is across every metric. So whether you're talking about NPS, whether you're talking about customer loyalty or referral or gross margin or the elasticity you have around price point or the ability to move into new categories, new geographies, there's a whole other game being played at the top of the pyramid. So they're the brands I'm most interested in, and the founders and entrepreneurs who want to build brands like that are the ones I'm most interested in. So they're the ones I'm talking about.
Do you find that when you meet people that are like, hey, we want you to come in and work with us, can you pick this pretty quickly? You're like, you're not quite in the mission or the promise of the brand as much as you need to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And it happens quite regularly. And I would say I'm really honest and really transparent at that point. And generally, if they haven't already decided I'm not for them, then we have a conversation where I say, I don't think I'm for you. Because there's lots of ways to get from A to B. Yeah. I'm privileged enough to be able to work with clients that I want to work with. Yeah. And I'm not driven to build out a portfolio for the sake of building out a portfolio. I'm driven to create case studies of what best in class looks like. Yeah. So that just juices me. I just love working with people who are that committed and they are that creative, and they really in their mind they genuinely to their bones believe they're going to make the world a better place with what they're doing, and that's exciting.
What about that is exciting to you? Like what is the element that you're like, it's this?
Okay, so earlier in my career, I would say it was creativity for the sake of creativity. The idea of working with, Sarah Jane and Heidi were just unbelievably creative people. And the ideas that were coming out of that studio were just so fun and so cool and so sexy, and girls were just dying to buy it. And it was just watching that creative process and supporting that creative process was more than enough. As I've got older, I think the world desperately needs to buy less shit.
I'm with you, man.
And I passionately believe, like one of the largest industries in the world is storage. I mean, the last thing we need is more stuff. Yeah. And so if we've got the money to buy 12 versions of something crap, why don't we just buy one that's really good, that might be 10 times the price, but it's beautiful and it's been made with real tender loving care. There's ethics and integrity that have gone into it. It's super high quality. It's going to last you probably longer than you're going to want to wear it, and then you can hand it on to someone else.
Do you feel like the market's maybe moving that way a little bit more?
At least it's getting a bit more airtime now. Like I think when I first started in fashion, luxury and designer was considered just a bit more ostentatious indulgence.
Yeah.
You know, I think now there's a greater understanding that at least some brands in that space actually are making things by hand in a way that it was made 100 years ago. And that is frankly more expensive than having children in Bangladesh make it.
Yeah.
So you are going to pay more, but you're not going to regret it. So, you know, I think what drives me now is my own sense of purpose is twofold. One, I want to see more Australian brands make it on the world stage.
Yeah.
Like, having worked in the US and Japan and the UK, I constantly think, God, there's great brands in Australia that should be here. Like, why aren't we here? Like, what is holding us back?
Do you think it's geography? Like you were saying before,
Partially.
Paris has this romantic old world feel to it.
Yeah.
New York has like, you know, Hugo Boss. It's got like this
Very commercial,
cutthroat capitalism kind of energy,
Yeah.
and it's sexy. And then you'd have like, you know, there's big brands in Japan.
Yeah.
Then you've got like, you know, Supremes in New York. Like, would you say that Australia's not quite there yet? Or do you think it's just a geographical thing because we're so far away? Like, what do you think that might be?
I think there's a combination of things. It's a really good question. I'll try to unpack the main ones quickly.
Yeah.
So geography, yes, because it plays to seasonality, and it's tough if you are in a seasonal category. So if you're making handbags or you're making watches or you're making electric bikes or what, obviously less of an issue. But if you're making seasonal product and it's summer here and it's winter there,
Oh,
then
I see.
you either have to get ahead or
Is that
you're a
because of
season
speed?
behind.
Because like fashion seems like the minute you get something out, people are copying you.
Definitely that.
Yeah.
And you know, there's just no customers for what. So if your best ideas, your most contemporary and current ideas have been poured into a summer collection to be delivered in summer in Australia, it's 6 months old by the time you're selling it in North America.
Yeah, right.
So you really have to set up 2 design teams, or one design team has responsibility for delivering 2 seasons at a time, which is kind of tough. Or you sell ahead and you say, okay, from now on, we're going to be North America centric or European centric or Japan centric, whatever it is. We're going to design for that season, and Australia will get it 6 months later. I mean, it's tough. Like there's difficult choices that have to be made in that. Secondly, I think, you know, frankly, a lot of investors are not supportive of Australian brands going overseas. So, and I understand why. There's a lot of corpses in the graveyard of failed attempts to go offshore for Australian brands.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
It seems to be easier to come in than it is to go
It's
out.
a lot easier. So I get it, but I do think there's somewhat of a failure of imagination there on 2 fronts. One, I think we do have something unique to say, that there is a distinct Australian culture. And, you know, if you've lived overseas, this is the most obvious thing I could possibly say. But I think a lot of Australians think that because we consume American media from day dot, and we love American artists and we love American musicians, and there's some similarity between the culture. It's a completely different culture. And having lived in the UK, completely different culture. So Australia does have a unique perspective. And yes, we have a troubled past, and no, not everything is perfect here, et cetera, et cetera. But there is sort of a kind of a ruggedness to Australia, the outdoorsy thing, the sporty thing, and then the sense of humor, which the Americans in particular love. You know, there's that quirkiness around the Australian character. And if you look at Australian actors, like Australian actors have done brilliantly overseas because they're not trying to re-engineer a supply chain for a different season. They just get on a plane and go to LA, and the best ones do really, really well. So there's an appetite for the Australian character and the Australian personality that is proven. It's very clear. But I think if you look at other categories outside of acting, really, the list gets pretty short pretty quickly. So it's a failure of imagination, I think, in terms of we do have something different to say. Like it's not selling ice to Eskimos. Our ice is different.
Right.
It's a different thing.
We're going to tap into not that high-end Paris energy. We're going to create our own.
Totally.
Yeah.
We should be creating our own. And we shouldn't be derivative of what's happening in North America or Europe, because we can come up with our own thing.
Right.
So there's that. And I think the other failure of imagination is, particularly today, there are ways of testing the market, the whole kind of test and learn, data-centric, e-com approach that allows you to test the waters in a CapEx light way and an OpEx light way that was very difficult even 10 years ago when I was 20 years ago when I was starting out at Sasson Bard.
Do you think that, like, to that point, in our market, or even in the fashion market, it's attracted a different breed of folks, like people that are very tech-centric, e-com centric, savvy with technology, versus maybe, go back 100 years, it was more the artisanal, fashion-obsessed individual.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think there's a much bigger part to play for. I mean, digital natives is such an overused term, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
those who are very comfortable jumping between platforms and thinking about different synergies between platforms and thinking about different ways to connect dots by leaning into various technologies. Definitely.
Yeah.
I do think, though, at the end of the day, I would rank that in the tactical list.
Yeah.
And I think there's nothing stopping us to think bigger. That Australia has to become more innovative, like we just do, right? Like you read the economic headlines and our productivity is declining. We've rode a mining boom for God knows how long, 20 plus years. And then you've got these pockets of extreme creativity, like your business and like others throughout Sydney and Melbourne, and some in Brisbane, some in Perth, and the other cities, I'm sure. I'm not familiar with them, though. But they tend to get a little bit siloed, and some of your most creative and innovative ideas get watered down.
Yeah.
Because there's not that courage of the conviction. And I think what I loved about my time overseas was there's not as much fear around finding the next investor dollar.
Okay.
I mean, Tom's a great example.
Yeah.
So we'd come out of these meetings where he just rejected a fairly significant check, and he'd say, we'll be fine. We'll be fine. I'm like, Tom, we got 2 weeks of cash left. He's like, no, we'll be fine. So he was not prepared to compromise. Whereas the conversation in Australia is, oh God, like, are there going to be any investors? And if you've got a heartbeat and you can sign a check, then we'll take you money, even if it involves creative compromise and if it involves.
So we don't have that venture capital, green patience energy that maybe they have in the US.
Venture capital, definitely. Family office, much more conservative typically. Even the trade investors. So, what happened with Tom, the way we recapitalized the business initially, and it went on to sell for a very big number to Xenia, but the initial recapitalization was through a Japanese investor who had come across the brand in Japan and loved it. He was just a fan. And he had a fast fashion group, actually, that was loosely attached to a larger group over there. And this is a true story. So we flew in to Tokyo with literally 10 days cash left in the bank. And actually, I'll jump back for a second just to give you a sense of how precarious the situation was. 2 really quick anecdotes. I got the job offer from Tom, and it was a nice bump in salary for me. It was a great salary. I came home to my wife at the time and was very proud of myself. And she's like, Josh, he's got 3 months of cash left. He could be paying you $5 million. It wouldn't matter. He doesn't have any money. It doesn't matter what it says on the contract. It's like, okay, yeah, good point. Then the other thing that was the week or 2 weeks after I started, the New York Post on page 6, their gossipy thing, said that it was like Tom Brown has thrown his last roll of the dice by employing an unknown Australian to attempt the third turnaround of his business. Yeah. So I was like, okay, all right, the odds are against us. Okay, that's all right.
Was a part of you like challenge accepted?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Because I was like, what have I got to lose?
Yeah.
And back here, no one had heard of Tom Brown. I mean, he was a massive deal in Europe and Japan and the US. Yeah. But I was telling friends about it back in. I was like, Tom Ford. I'm like, no, it's not Tom Ford, man. It's Tom Brown. Yeah. Anyway.
So just a quick caveat. Like, what do you think it is about you that made you so alluring to people that were running these companies? Like, what was the connective tissue when you were able to go into these interviews and get them to bring you in?
That's a really good question. And I think because I pondered this myself, like, even some of the stories we were chatting about before we came in, that was, dream come true stuff for me, meeting some of the people that we were talking about and, hanging out with movie stars and rock stars and stuff. And I was like, how on earth did I get into this room? This just seems highly improbable.
Yeah, dude, how did you get into a room with Tom Cruise, Will Smith, John Mayer, Madonna, and Eric Bana?
I know. And Eric Bana was the coolest one in there, I got to tell you. He was awesome. Yeah, that was Brian Lord's CAA pre-Oscars party. That was another story. But I think there is some combination of you're an Aussie.
Yeah.
The Americans are genuinely affectionate for Australians. And I can't tell you how many times I heard that Americans say some version of what I love about Australia is it's like California in the 50s. You know, it's like full of optimism, full of hope, great energy. You haven't polluted the shit out of it yet. It's not overrun with special interest groups. And it just feels like California felt in the 50s and 60s. Now, I have no idea that's true because, you know, even I wasn't born back then. I certainly hadn't been to California back then.
But you can imagine, you know, the 50s in America seemed very optimistic.
Particularly in California, because it was like tech was just starting to happen. It was defense, and defense led into tech, and Hollywood was there. And yeah, it was razor sharp and it was brutal and corrupt and all the rest of it. But there was a sense of the West representing this kind of optimism, I guess.
So you feel like Tom Brown looked at you and was like, this guy's got a little bit of pep.
He's got some pep. He's got some energy. He's clearly resilient. You know, like there was at that point in time, it was getting pretty tough over there. Like there were the first signs that the recession hadn't really hit yet, but I think Bear Stearns had collapsed. Bear Stearns had collapsed, and I can't remember whether Lehman's had sort of gone sideways yet or not. But it was very clear that something big was about to happen in the economy. The stock market had started to fall. Investors were closing their wallets, and I was up for it. And I think I was like, you know, like you said, challenge accepted. I'm like, this guy is an artist, and you know, so I get a bit choked up when I talk about it. He's just a beautiful human being.
But go into that, man. Like what?
I had dinner with him.
Yeah.
So I first started consulting to him, and I had been directed in his direction by someone else I had worked with.
Yeah.
And another gentleman, Mark Robinson, who's one of my best friends now, and godfather of my eldest daughter. He's Diane Sawyer's executive producer and very senior at ABC Disney. And he was a friend of Tom's as well. So there was a couple of people pointing me in Tom's direction.
Yeah.
And Tom was resistant to meeting me. He's like, he's worked for like a contemporary women's brand, and, you know, we're a luxury men's brand. I'm not really sure, you know, I don't really get it, blah, blah, blah. But things got tougher and tougher for him. And eventually he reached out. I had dinner with him, and he just wept at the table. And he was, you know, literally just weeping and saying, you know, I've worked my whole life for this. It's so important to me, and I know it's going to be amazing, but I've just got to get through this, and I don't know how to get through it. And he had some very big debts in the business that were personally guaranteed, and you know, it was looking pretty dire. And so when I asked him to unpack what it was that, you know, he was so excited about in the brand, and what, if anything, he would compromise around in the brand and the assortment, which at that point was very high-end men's apparel and tricky apparel. Like I was mentioning before, like we were all top to toe. This is after getting the job, after all top to toe, and people would laugh at us. Like we'd be walking through the meatpacking district, and there'd be 5 or 6 of us, all in Tom. It's middle of winter. We're walking through snow. We've got ankles exposed. We're wearing these tight little jackets that only come to here, and ties with tie bars, and he said, "There's nothing wrong with the brand. There's nothing wrong with the assortment. I've just had bad advice. I need production to be rationalized. I'm spending too much money on product, and I really believe that I've got something to say that is really important, and I'm not prepared to compromise." So, and I saw him in action in these meetings, particularly some of the creditor meetings, where there was a factory in Brooklyn, won't name names, but they were sort of. It seemed to me like something out of the Goodfellas, or like these guys turned up and they were huge, and they were on one side of the table, and Tom, myself, and a bankruptcy attorney were on the other side of the table. And I was basically saying, look, you can talk to me or you can talk to him, the bankruptcy attorney. So if you talk to me, we can figure something out. If you talk to him, it's done. So we need to work this out. And they were banging the table and screaming and spitting, and Tom was just completely composed. And so I think he showed to me, A, he had a very strong creative vision. B, he was completely committed to it, and he felt that the world needed to hear what he had to say. And his strength, his personal strength, his character and resilience was so inspiring to me that I really wanted to help him.
Do you feel like there was a narrative there you bought into? Like, you know, when you watch a Disney film, you want the character to win.
Yeah.
And you connected with this individual. Maybe he saw optimism or resilience in you, and he's like, I need a bit of that.
I think I had I guess I'm an optimist by nature. I've got a high level of energy. And I think as a kid who was bullied, I fucking hate seeing people being bullied. So I was like, this guy's being bullied. Like I need to help him out. And he was tough. Like he's a tough guy. But he needed some support on the commercial side that he just hadn't had. So I think it was a combination of things, and we met at the perfect time. But going to Japan, so I guess where I was going at that was the investment community in Australia, you just never see this in Australia. So we flew into Japan. Yeah, Ishikawa-san was the gentleman's name who we were meeting. Typical Japanese meeting. There's like 8 people around the boardroom table. We had a translator who was not keeping up, and we were trying to sort of understand what was going on. And I had a whole pitch ready and a PowerPoint and all that sort of shit. We had product, and so I got up to talk, and Ishikawa-san interrupted. The translator said, Ishikawa-san would like to speak. I was like, well, great. Sat back down again. Ishikawa-san would like to give you $1 million US now. There's no need for a contract. He believes in Tom. He believes in you. We'll work out the contract later.
Whoa.
And I was like my mind was completely blown. So I was like, that sounds really good.
And that's exactly what Tom Brown wanted. He wanted the creative control and someone to believe in him.
And he had complete creative control. In the end, they took about 30% of the business. And the implied valuation, because they then recapitalized it, they paid off debts, the implied valuation was a lot. And he then went on to sell it to Xenia for $500 million. So had a very good run. And he still owns a good chunk of it, I think 20% or so. So I caught up with him last year, and he's living at Astor Place, Upper East Side. It's like about as storied as you can get. It's this beautiful townhouse, an $80 million townhouse, and he shares an acre of lawn on the East River with 4 other townhouses, and his neighbour is the Secretary General of the UN. So I arrived, and there were guys with machine guns and stuff out the front. I'm like, wow, Tom's really upgraded his security.
Yeah.
I guess he's super important now.
When you see guns, it is a little intimidating. I was recently in Mexico City, and Tom Brady was there.
Oh, wow.
And he was on stage. And I remember I'd come back to the venue, and I was like, I just want to get a peek at the back of his head. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's Tom Brady. And I remember this guy came out from behind the curtain with his hand on an Uzi. He was like, what are you doing here? I'm like, oh, I'm one of the speakers. And he's like, oh, radioed. He's all clear. But there's something about that that's so like, that's another level.
It's super intimidating.
So you show up, there's people with guns.
And when they got their hand and the finger's not on the trigger, it's just above the trigger. It's like, can't you just leave it hanging?
Yeah,
like,
you don't need to be like action ready, man.
My God.
We're here at a conference, bro.
It's not Afghanistan. So I think for me, that was one of several experiences that gave me an insight into that there's a different way to approach investment. And it doesn't always have to be about contracts and extracting the lowest possible price and the greatest degree of equity. There are investors out there, and I've met others in North America like this. Ishikawa-san was very unusual in Japan, who believe in creatives that have a really strong vision, and they've proven out the vision to a point. So this is not a pure startup, obviously.
Yeah, they've gotten to a point. They've had success.
Things have gone sideways, and they need some help. Whereas I think in Australia, there's definitely. I'm not saying there's no investors like that in Australia. That would be completely unfair. And in fact, I know a couple who are very open-minded and very creatively driven. But all I'm saying is that in the main, there's a more conservative approach, and people have made so much money in Australia out of residential property and investing in mining companies that, the thought of, am I going to roll the dice on something highly creative that has a chance of going to 100 million, but a good chance of going to zero? It's a tougher sell here. Whereas Americans are investing in tech startups and SaaS startups and social media startups and fashion brands and cosmetic brands and
almost
beer
like
brands.
The stock market. Like, yep, take a punt.
I'll take a punt. Yeah. Exactly. And almost everyone has a portion of their portfolio, which is the I'll take a punt portion. And that those stories of seeing deals done in bars that's all true. I saw that in California, and I saw it in New York, where literally you'd be ordering a drink and there'd be guys scribbling on the back of a coaster, deal terms. So you don't see a lot of that in Sydney. People talking about their, how much their house has gone up, but you don't see a lot of people sort of investing in startups on the back of a paper napkin.
Do you think it's our culture? Do you think it's our industry? Do you think it's our financial situation?
I think this is going to sound really weird, but I think we've been a little bit too lucky.
Okay.
I think things have been good here for a really long time. And we haven't had to, and there's exceptions. There's some cool deep tech stuff happening with CSIRO spin-offs, and there's some really cool stuff happening in biomed. And so there's exceptions. But in the main, the bulk of Australia's wealth has come from extractive industries, agriculture and property. So we haven't built up a huge base of creative wealth. And again, there's exceptions to that. I'd say Atlassian is a great exception to that.
Great
Canva Denver's
exception.
a great exception. So there's exceptions, but they kind of prove the rule. You know, they're not the rule. So I'd love to see that change that we've started to see, with those two examples being examples of that change. I'd love to see that accelerate, and I'd love to see more Australian investors take a little more risk on young Aussies who are really clever, innovative, and have a big vision.
Yeah.
And because the other thing, the last thing I'll say on this in the States, which I love, and this is a cultural difference, and I'm not saying America's better than Australia, you know, I'm not saying all that. A failed founder in Australia is, you know, there's shame attached to that.
Yeah, I would agree.
There's investors in America that only invest in founders that have failed because they don't want to pay for your first failure. They want to know that you have burnt your savings, you've learnt some brutal lessons, and provided you can unpack what those lessons are and really clearly articulate what you do differently next time, that's investable.
Well, that makes sense because it's almost, I don't know what the rule is. I saw this somewhere, I think it was in Forbes, and they were saying that the average millionaire had started and failed on average 14 businesses, gone bust in one of them, bankrupted in at least once before they find. It's almost like through those failures and those hard, brutal lessons, you go, all right, well, next time I'm going to do the books. Next time I'm not going to hire people like that. Next time I'm not going to throw down too much money at this phase of the business.
Yes.
You start to just, there's like unwritten rules about startups.
They are unwritten.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm hoping that sort of changes. But academia is so behind on this. Like you look at an MBA curriculum and it's just like, you know. So I think those unwritten rules can only be learnt, and you can get lucky. And by lucky, I mean you can have a really great idea. You can surround yourself with the right people who know how to execute. You can bring in the right investors who are supportive. And there's a degree of genius involved in every founder who gets to that, but there's a bit of luck too. And equally, I've seen really talented founders with really great concepts fail because a couple of things just didn't go their way.
Right.
Now, is that someone who is uninvestable, who should show up in middle management at a consulting firm or, you know, Deloitte's or something? Or do we want to roll the dice on this guy or girl again? And my personal perspective is that we have to shift our thinking around entrepreneurialism. We have to be prepared to go in a little bit earlier. We have to be prepared to tolerate a higher failure rate because, frankly, you know, innovation by its very nature is trying something that hasn't been done before.
Correct.
So it's not always going to pan out the way you think it's going to pan out. And then in terms of not shaming those who have suffered financial or economic consequences from a failure, because failure is pretty temporary unless you allow it to be permanent. And I think culturally we have a tendency here, again, it's not universal, but we have a tendency to tar for life those who we perceive to have failed.
Yeah. You seem to be someone that really is heart-led in business, which I would say is quite rare. I think a lot of people think they are or they say that they are, but I can feel it. Where does that come from? Like, why do you feel like you're heart-led in business?
That's a good question. I think, a couple of things. I think, I touched earlier on, I just hate bullies. I think there is a part of it's, childhood stuff, which we probably don't want to unpack now. But I think, our identities are formed in our youth. And I think depending on the mix of experiences you have, it can have quite a profound impact for quite a long time. And I think there's a little bit of the underdog scrappy kind of thing to me. And so I really love seeing people have a go.
Yeah.
And that sort of man in the arena, that poem, I think I hate the critic. If you want to criticize, get in and have a go. But don't criticize the man or these days woman in the arena because the poem's like 2,000 years old. So I'm talking about the man in the arena. The individual in the arena. The critics, we give too much. We place too much weight on the critic. So there's part of that. I also think that I just love working with good people. And I think, as you get older, your priorities change a little bit, or, maybe not everyone, but for me, they have. And of course, we all have, at this point, I measure financial success as a byproduct of hopefully doing good stuff with my clients rather than the financial outcome being the primary driver. And I do a certain amount of pro bono work and I do a certain amount of work that is very lowly paid. But for clients who can afford it, I charge appropriate rates. But I only work with people I really believe in and that I have a sense of shared purpose, shared value, shared purpose. And I think at the end of the day, Kane, I think it just makes me feel good.
Yeah. I love that.
Life's too short. There's, so my dad died just pre-COVID, and we were super close. And I think that was a huge reminder. I wouldn't say wake up call, because I think I already had a sense of this before he passed, but a massive reminder of just how fleeting this stuff is. And just before Christmas, my wife, my incredibly healthy, strong, gorgeous Steph, was diagnosed with breast cancer. And she's been really lucky. It was caught early. It had started to spread, but not too far. And it's been caught early, and her prognosis is excellent. But again, just what a reminder. And the notion of turning up every day and working with people who you don't respect, who have a different value set to you, who are looking to be pretty extractive from the universe and not particularly contributive. That mindset of scarcity, it's like, gimme, 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 gimme. Like, there's not enough to go around, so I need my part, Whereas I sort of come from a mindset of abundance. I mean, the universe is ever expanding. There's more than enough for everyone. So let's do it in a way that's going to contribute and connect and ultimately create a sense of community. And great brands do that. And that's why I love working with great brands, because they do create a sense of shared purpose and a shared narrative that is ultimately directed towards a higher purpose. Just more fun.
Yeah. And you spoke about, your beautiful wife, Steph, and your father's passing. For you, oftentimes I hear people go through similar things in business, and it can be quite a lot to deal with.
Yeah.
A bit about my background. As a kid, I grew up in and out of foster care. My mother would take morphine and drink, and I kind of grew up in an unstable home, which led to bullying, which led to communication issues through school and all the rest of it. And me, I've kind of got that scrappy underdog, go get them.
I like it. I knew I liked you.
I could tell. But for you, man, when these things happen and these moments in life catch you off guard, you go in one way and then boom, something happens.
Yeah.
How do you as an individual bounce back from that? Where do you pull energy from?
Yeah. I think another great question. I think, a couple of things. Over the years, I've come to the conclusion that when you make decisions in a mindset of fear or anger, they're crappy decisions. So the first thing to do is to just make sure you're not making any big decisions. You're not saying anything you can't take back. You are not making permanent assumptions or permanent decisions around temporary problems. So number one, just give yourself some time. And that could be 10 minutes, it could be 2 weeks, it could be a walk around the block, it could be 2 hours of meditating, it could be a surf, whatever works for you. But I now, I actually will stop a conversation and say, you know what, you're upsetting me. I know you don't intend to, but I'm not going to continue discussing it right now. Let's come back to it. Because I had a vicious temper as a kid, and I said some awful things to people that I wish I could take back.
Me too, man. I had a lot of that, yeah.
And a lot of, I had a big chip on my shoulder, and I was a bullied kid. And the lesson I learned, unfortunately, a bad lesson to learn that's taking me a while to unlearn, is that, offense is the best form of defense. And it's not always true. Unless you're playing basketball.
Sometimes it's great. I'm with you, but if you stay in that offense mode all the time, it can become a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's not, without getting too woo-woo about it, I think there is a higher self, right? And depending on your spiritual, non-spiritual, religious, non-religious, whatever your belief set is, we can all relate to the idea that in certain states, we think differently. We're operating on a higher level of consciousness. We're more creative. We're more connected. We're more compassionate. We've just got a capacity to operate above the fray. And I find when I'm in that mindset, I make really good decisions and really joyful decisions. And they give me a lot of juice.
Something out of love and passion versus fear and scarcity.
100%.
Yeah.
And so I think a practice that and my practice has a couple of different components these days with some meditation, and I'm the world's worst guitar player, but I'm attempting to learn the guitar. I find that, do you know what, when you do something you're shit at, so you're really good at what you do now, right? So you do a lot of it. And once you've figured out what you're really good at, that's exactly what we do, because the world rewards us. We get respect, we get appreciation, we earn money. That's the way it's meant to work. The problem with that is that from a neurological perspective, we're kind of, nerves that fire together wire together, right? So we start to lose a bit of plasticity. So when you do something you're really shit at, on a biological level, you are recreating or re-energizing neuroplasticity, which is great for anti-aging and all that good stuff. But you also have to be present. Because if you are thinking about something else and you're already bad at the guitar, it's like, oh no, I'm thinking about tomorrow. I'm thinking about the meeting, or I'm thinking about the call I got to do. So finding a practice, whether it's meditation or some sort of breath work or surfing. I've got friends who are great surfers and they love it. I'm a shit surfer.
Surfing's a great one for that.
Right.
For me, surfing almost, you can't think about anything else.
No.
You're getting smashed with waves. You're outside. There's a breeze. There's chaos, rips, waves. Rocks. You're just so you're forced to be in the moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. You're forced to be in the moment. And when you think about those times in life that you're otherwise forced to be in the moment, they're pretty limited. You're falling in love. You're making love. You're playing with your child. You're playing with your dog. Like there are certainly things where hopefully you're very in the moment. But most of the day, we are somewhere between, the familiar past and the predictable future, as Joe Dispenza calls it. We're just jumping back and forth on this little loop.
It's almost like as a child, you're exploring things.
Yes.
And then as an adult, maybe your time gets compressed because you've got children, you got a dog, you got a job, you got responsibilities, phone calls, relatives, a lot going on.
Yeah.
So then you have less explorative time.
Yes.
So then you prioritize maybe the things that reward you the most and deprioritize things that, like playing guitar and here and there, Like, so do you think it's good practice to seek that something that is difficult?
Yes.
And create a new space for you to be present with a new thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Doing hard things. And I think we know that we need a level of adversity to become stronger. That's the muscular adaptation process. We need to do hard things to become fitter. VO2 max will not improve until you're exceeding your, pushing right up against your max threshold. Intellectually, mentally, emotionally, across the board, you've got to do hard things. Plus, it's got the great advantage of taking you out of whatever just made you angry and fearful. And it creates that space for your mind to go, oh, okay, I'm looking at this a different way now.
Yeah.
And so I think, the stresses of building a business and having a family and managing a mortgage, particularly in Sydney, and private school fees and all that other craziness, it can become overwhelming. So if you're not creating a practice for yourself, whatever that looks like for you, then I think it can get very difficult.
What's your advice to someone who's in a predicament where they don't have that hard thing? Like, do you just say, just go test a few things out, explore? Like, do you have a process when you're in that state?
I think definitely explore. And like the first time I encountered meditation, I went to a Zen school in London just because I was intellectually interested in Zen, but the meditation did not take. I didn't get it. I'm just sitting here, nothing's happening, So sometimes you'll try something and it won't work, but then come back to it. Meditation for me has been really tough. My brain is pretty active, and getting it to still a little bit, or at least as I now know, it's not about making it still, but the thoughts become slippery. You're just not attaching to them. So things are drifting in, but you just let it go. You just let it drift in and out. That's still pretty hard for me. So you try different things. Even guitar, I tried taking that up like 15 years ago, and I was upset with myself, classic young man thinking. I was upset with myself that I wasn't Jimi Hendrix within like 4 weeks, as if it was some sort of competition.
I want to shred.
How many? I want my friends to be awed.
And if you don't get that immediate reward, you're like bored. And moving on to the next thing.
I'm good at that other thing. I'll go back to that.
So do you think
that's what we tend to do?
Do you think your ability to explore, try new things, you seem to be someone that's quite agile, quite nimble, quite able to kind of go with the problem and follow it down a rabbit hole and make the most of it?
Yes.
Is that something that's led you through this industry? Like what do you think your superpower's been in your career?
That's a tough one. I think, let me think about that. So curiosity, like just being insatiably curious, and that's not something I've, built up. That's just been me my whole life. I'm just endlessly curious. I particularly love to understand why people think the way they think. And I was particularly attracted to creative people, I think, from a very young age because they thought differently to me. and the way that they were seeing the world and creating possibilities where I saw emptiness was just fascinating. So I think a huge degree of curiosity, and which led into a great respect for the creative process, because there is something mystical and magical about it. Like when you see a world-class creative pull an idea out of the air and manifest it, and it become this worldwide hit, it's pretty addictive. Like I want to keep seeing that. It's a really inspiring thing. So I think I've got a huge amount of respect for what creative people do. And I think also that with that scrappy thing we were talking about, and that, it's a never say die thing. I just don't. My grandfather was a prisoner of war of the Japanese for 4 years in World War II, and had a pretty tough time and came back. He weighed 38 kilos when he came back.
Christ.
And so I grew up with those stories. So whenever I'm having a bad day, I think, well, I'm not starving to death in a prison camp in Burma. So there is sort of that. I want to kind of live up to the expectations I've set for myself around being resilient and just never, ever giving up. And I think that, and this is now going to sound very woo-woo, but bear with me, there's this notion in Buddhism that the gift of a human life is incredibly rare. Because as you know, Buddhists believe that we can be reincarnated as anything, right? So we could have been anything, a plant, an insect, a snake, a dolphin, but we got humanity, and that is incredibly rare, and it's a very special gift. And that's really sunk in to the point where I think, I'm just going to make the most of every day. Like if you really think about it, if you really believe that this is your one trip round, which lots of people believe, or you're going to go on to something else, but it's not this. So this is our one experience of being human.
And like up next is cockroach. So make the most of it.
I think I'd be lucky to make it a cockroach. So, why not go hard?
Yeah.
And the external stuff, it just doesn't matter as much. In fact, it doesn't matter at all if you've got a firm grip of your own mindset. Like you know why you're doing what you're doing. Sometimes it's going to work, sometimes it's not. Some people are going to like you, some people won't. Sometimes you're going to get paid, sometimes they're going to rip you off. But it doesn't matter, because you've got a really clear idea on what are you on earth for? How driven are you to achieve that? How committed? Is there real conviction around it? And then it's about understanding your value set in terms of how you're going to make it happen, because there's lots of ways of achieving a purpose. But if you've nailed down those two things, it's a lot easier to right yourself when you start to tip. Not instant, some days it's harder than others, but you've got a methodology. Yeah.
Beautifully said. Poetic. Very, very concise. There's one last question I would love to ask you before we go. And we like to ask this on every episode. It's a bit of a weird one. It might lead you down a weird story rabbit hole.
I'm good at that.
What's the weirdest thing you've ever done to make a profit?
Oh, my Lord. What's the weirdest thing I've ever done to make a profit? I mean, look, okay, I'll tell you two stories. I don't know if this counts as a profit or not, but it was at university, and my best friend at the time got a job managing a strip bar. And this is back in the, it's so a while back, it's like in
Where
the
is this leading?
90s. And he called me one afternoon and said, get your boys together, come down and have a few drinks. No one was stripping. It was like the afternoon, but it just happened to be a strip bar. My boss isn't here, and I can comp you all. So I got together 8 friends, and we all went down to this strip bar in Brisbane, and we were just drinking the way you drink when you're that age, with wild abandon, no sense of tomorrow, complete stupidity, and racked up quite a sizable bill. And this is at a point in time when each of us had maybe $20 in our bank account. Yeah. And the bill was about, in fact, I don't know what it was because we weren't counting. But anyway, then Joe, this friend of mine, comes over to me and says, hey man, the boss has shown up and you need to pay. I was like, dude, so we went around the table and we came up like $64, and the bill was $920. And then he leant in and he said, the boss here is Anne-Marie Tilley. And that's when the Fitzgerald inquiry was happening. And Anne-Marie Tilley was a mafia-connected crime lord in Brisbane. Yeah. And she was there with 2 giant Samoan guys. And I was like, oh man, this is bad. Yeah. And she's like, she's looking at us. Joe's kind of like, oh, I'm okay. So I went up to Anne-Marie and I said, look, just hear me out. If I strip for your girls, will you write off the tab? She's like, definitely. So there's like four 4 old dudes waiting for the strip show to start. Like, so when I say old dudes, they're probably my age now, like in their 50s, sort of crusty looking guys out at scattered tables. And the girls, they just thought it was hilarious. So they dragged me out the back and said, what do you want to be? I'm like, I'll be a cowboy. So it's like a little sparkly vest and a little toy cap gun and boots. And then they put on, it was Prince's song Cream.
Oh, perfect. Beautiful. I can see it.
So I came on and did my routine, and you know, I didn't know you.
I like how you said my routine as if you like.
I've been waiting for this moment. You know,
I kind of wanted
all those
to do
hours in front of the mirror, coming together.
Yeah.
And I didn't know you weren't meant to go down to nothing, so I went down to nothing. The girls were all cheering. The guys were going, "What the fuck is this?"
Like, I'm paying off my tab.
Yeah, that's right. These poor guys waiting for these gorgeous girls got me instead. So that was probably that was one way, I guess, but it wasn't a profit because we were really just paying off a debt.
It counts. Talk about agility, willing to get in and do it, man.
Totally.
Yeah.
No fear.
Yeah.
Give it a go.
Damn, dude. Did you put that on your resume when you met Ralph Lauren?
No, I did not. And I still remember looking at my friends and they were doubled over laughing.
Yeah.
Like, just thought it was hilarious, yelling at me, it's a bit cold in the room, is it? And I'm like, shut up, man. I'm paying your bill.
You want to get up here? Yeah.
Why don't you give it a go?
Yeah.
Yeah. Lots of fun.
Ending that on a banger, man. Dude, that's our best story yet. I don't think anyone's topped that, man. Jesus. Josh, thank you so much, man.
Oh, thank you for having
Appreciate
me.
you being here. Yeah. Thank you so much, man. We really loved your energy. Love that you wear your heart on your sleeve. You see business in a very beautiful way. And it's just been infectious and fun to hang out with you, dude.
Likewise. I've loved it. Thank you very much for having me. It's been really fun.